Where is, I'll go right to this. So I'm going to just do this and go right to this, right?
You have to do your opening statement first, though.
Yeah,
That's the
okay.
reason why.
That's
So
right.
just keep it to the end of it.
What?
I mean, having his introduction before he speaks.
Yeah. All right, Elliot's not going to hear. I'd like to call the hearing to order and welcome everyone here. If we all huddle together, the room won't seem as cold. It's a big room, but it's an important day. So the hearings come to order. The subcommittee is meeting today to hear testimony on democracy in the NATO alliance. It's an effort to look at upholding our shared democratic values. And without objection, all members will have 5 days to submit statements and questions, extraneous materials for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. I'll now make a brief opening statement and then turn it over to the ranking member for his opening statement. On November 9th, 1989, 30 years ago this month, the Berlin Wall began to fall. After that day, people in East Germany and across Eastern Europe began the slow process of reconnecting with the world and looking beyond the Iron Curtain. Many former post-Soviet states began to throw off the yoke of Soviet occupation and welcomed in a new era built on the pillars of freedom, democracy, and the rule of law. Today we're joined by a living example of that fight. And I'm reminded that President Walesa was the first non-head of state ever to address a joint session of Congress, and that occurred almost 30 years ago to the day, just 2 days difference. We want to thank President Walesa, the former president of Poland, for being here, and thank you so much for your example, which is as relevant today, if not more so, than it ever has been. It's really important to remember everything that's taken us all together to come to this point. In the shadow of the world wars, instability, oppression, people united around shared values, ideals, and actually stood up to transform their countries and build democracies. I share the legacy of many families that lost a family member in one of those wars on European soil. But that's what it takes. Democracy takes effort and engagement and commitment. It just didn't happen. Europe is a very different place today than it was 30 years ago because of the hard-fought efforts of so many people, including yourself. It's important that we recognize the commitment that everyday people made to building democracy in Europe and how much that changed the world to become what it is today. Since that time, our world has seen the expansion of multilateral institutions built on shared democratic values to advance global security. One of those institutions is NATO, an alliance that is now 70 years old. Just a decade after the end of the Cold War, NATO welcomed the Czech Republic, Hungary, Poland, then in 2004, Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, Slovakia, Slovenia. And since then, our friends in Albania, Croatia, and Montenegro also joined our alliance and will soon welcome North Macedonia as our newest member. The first lines of the treaty are clear, stating that all parties, quote, are determined to safeguard the freedom, common heritage, and civilization of their peoples, founded on the principles of democracy, individual liberty, and rule of law, unquote. Unfortunately, I worry we've taken so much for granted on both sides of the Atlantic. The core pillars of what made us in this alliance so strong and what we've worked on in the past decade, we've become complacent upholding these key democratic values. We've seen the rule of law threatened and undermined by government officials in allied countries. We've watched protections for journalists and a free and independent media curtailed. we find that the checks and balances that once kept democratic institutions independent and accountable to the people have eroded as corruption and politicalization have been allowed to take hold. Perhaps most alarming, just last month, Turkey launched an attack in Syria against Kurdish forces who have been working with U.S. troops to combat ISIS. Our own troops were withdrawn from an area ahead of Turkey's incursion into Syria, and our allies were not properly consulted, leading to their forces being potentially put at risk. This is not how democratic countries that are part of the strongest alliance in modern history are supposed to act. But today, just a matter of weeks after this egregious security issue within our alliance, President Erdogan is here at the White House, meeting with our President. Which brings me to my next point. While this hearing is being held in the Foreign Affairs Committee, it's not focused domestically on the United States. It's important to note that the issue is not unique to Europe. Here in the U.S., our democratic norms and institutions are being challenged from within as much as from external factors without. We all need to do better, and we all can do better. Democracy is a work in progress, and it's the unwavering commitment of governments, but also, importantly, citizens, to never stop promoting the rights and freedoms we value so greatly. I think if we look back 30 years ago, it would ring true that if presented with a choice of having these freedoms or not having them, we choose to have them. Well, it's each of our responsibilities to act to defend that choice every day. It's our responsibility to hold each other, our governments, and our elected officials, our allies, accountable to protecting and strengthening our democracy and our democratic values. We're here today to discuss what that means, what we must do better, what we must do better to show that decades later we're still committed to this experiment, its values, and what's embodied within them, especially that the commitment remains strong among our allies who are sworn to protect and defend. Thank you for being here. A special thanks to President Walesa and to our panelists who we'll hear from shortly. I'll now recognize the ranking member for his opening statement, and then we'll turn to President Walesa for his remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. President, thank you for being here, as well as the rest of the panel for joining us today. For almost 70 years, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization has formed the cornerstone of national security policy for the post-war world order. The strength of our alliance has successfully defeated communism, halted genocide, protected our citizens from terrorism, and maintained cohesion with our like-minded democratic partners. NATO is not some outdated relic from past conflicts. We're living in a world where repression is on the rise and human freedom is again increasingly at threat. Our resolve and stability has helped maintain peace in a world drowning with strong men. That is why I strongly believe in the NATO alliance. Just last week, Chairman Keating and I introduced a resolution commemorating the 30th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall, a symbol which divided Europe between hope and prosperity on the one side and despair of communism on the other. Unfortunately, it appears that there are some in the NATO alliance that have forgotten the pain of living behind the Iron Curtain and are flirting with the same repressive strategies employed by the former Soviet Union. It's important in this process and discussion to also recognize the misinformation and the division that Russian counter-misinformation plays in building these problems. I'm worried about President Orban, for instance, open praise of repressive leaders like Vladimir Putin. Maintaining cordial relations with one's neighbors is necessary, but openly praising the leader of a nation who would oppress your people given the chance seems very ill-advised. But I believe that no leader has turned their back on NATO's democratic values as much as President Erdogan of Turkey. Whether it's stifling political dissent, jailing journalists, increasing cooperation with Russia, or the recent incursion into Syria, it's clear that the U.S. must seriously reevaluate its relationship with the Turkish government. 18 months ago, President Erdogan came to the United States, where he looked on as his security forces violently attacked peaceful protesters in Washington, D.C. It's only fitting that he's back here in D.C. today as we hold this hearing. America must make clear that we stand with freedom-loving people of Turkey, but that we cannot and will not support Erdogan's spiral into authoritarianism. I also think it's important that in order to talk about fixing internal governments within the NATO alliance, we have to follow through on our promises to countries that we make to come into NATO if they make reforms. I just got back from being in the country of Georgia for a week, and it was amazing to me to watch an occupied friend, a great friend of the United States, continue to stand patiently in the face of Russian provocations, including borderization, including kidnapping of people on the other side of the illegally occupied territory. But Georgia continues to press ahead with fixes to its judicial system, to its media, with fixes to its governance, in order to follow through on the promise made to them by the NATO alliance. But there are a couple specifically in NATO that are scared of provoking the Russians, which actually is always amusing to me that the NATO alliance would be afraid of an economy 1/30th the size. In closing, I want to note that while I am concerned with the regression of democratic values in Europe, they are still our allies. As long as they're willing to work with us to strengthen their democracy, we will never abandon them. I look forward to hearing from the panel today. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back the balance.
I'd like to thank the ranking member and tell people that the first panel will be President Walesa, and that panel will conclude after a statement, so that we'll just break for a short 3 to 5 minutes and convene the second panel at that point. If there are members that came in late that wanted to greet the President personally during that break, feel free to do that. And now I'll introduce our witness. His Excellency, Lech Walesa, has long been a tireless labor activist and advocate for democracy who helped form and lead Poland's first independent trade union, Solidarity. During the communist period in Poland, he brought this together at a very difficult time. President Walesa received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1983 for his activism, but he was unable to accept it himself out of fear of not being able to return to his home country of Poland. Originally a humble electrician from the Polish city of Gdansk, President Walesa became the leader of a movement to throw off the chains of communist oppression and return Poland to its rightful place among democratic nations. A staunch supporter of freedom, he went on to become the first elected president of Poland. Since that time, President Walesa, through the Lech Walesa Institute, has been a strong voice to uphold democratic values in Europe. We're honored to have him here with us today. I'll just note that we'll not be dealing with the question and answer period again for the people that had just come in. And now we'll ask the President for his statement and remarks. And again, thank you for being here.
We the people, that is how what do I do?
I think you can do two.
Okay, thank you. We the people, this was exactly how I started my address 30 years ago.
Jako rewolucjonista dziś musiałbym powiedzieć 2 razy te same zdanie.
As a revolutionary, I would have to repeat the same sentence twice.
Wtedy kończyliśmy pewną epokę.
Back then, we were putting an end to a certain era.
Wielką epokę podziałów Europy i świata.
The era of great divisions, deep divisions in the world and in Europe.
I to temu pokoleniu udało się.
And our generation succeeded in bringing these divisions to the end.
Ale jednocześnie na horyzoncie powstała nowa epoka.
At the same time, a new era appeared on the horizon.
Epoka intelektu, informacji, globalizacji.
That of intellect, information and globalization.
I ten czas, obecny czas jest dużo trudniejszy i gorszy od poprzedniego.
And I would actually say that today's period, today's challenges are greater than those we witnessed 30 years ago.
Właściwie wszystkie dziedziny, w tym rola Stanów Zjednoczonych, powinna ulec zmianie.
Actually, all the areas of our life, including the role of the United States, should be reformed.
Na skróty można powiedzieć tak, jedna epoka upadła, druga nie powstała.
Briefly speaking, we could say that the old era came to an end and collapsed, yet the new one has not fully emerged.
Czas, w jakim się znaleźliśmy, ja nazywam epoka słowa.
This transitory period in which we are living now is something I refer to as the era of the word.
Najpierw było słowo, a słowo ciałem się jutro stanie.
First came the word, which will turn flesh only tomorrow.
Więc musimy bardzo dużo rozmawiać, robić tego typu spotkania.
So we have to debate very broadly and organize hearings of this kind, conferences and meetings,
By zauważyć różność tych epok.
to realize how different the two eras I'm talking about are.
Technologię doprowadziliśmy do wysokości takiej, że wiele tematów nie mieści się w naszych krajach, państwach.
We have advanced our technologies so greatly that many aspects of our life no longer can be confined to respective countries, respective states.
I to ten rozwój przede wszystkim ciśnie nas na zmiany.
And I would actually say that this technological advancement is the factor that presses us to go ahead and to improve things.
Każdy kraj miał swoją drogę historyczną.
Each country followed its different historical path.
Dopracował się swoich rozwiązań, nawet innej religii.
Each had provided its own solutions and each followed even a different religion.
I żeby budować większe struktury, to musimy to wszystko widzieć.
And if we want to unite, integrate ourselves in larger structures, we must realize that these differences are there.
Oczywiście w Stanach to może nie widać, ale w Europie to dokładnie widać.
Obviously, maybe in the perspective of the United States, you do not observe this phenomenon here so profoundly, but we can see it very clearly in Europe.
W Europie mogliśmy znieść granice, wprowadzić euro.
We were able to open up borders within Europe, introduce euro as single currency.
A nawet możemy, każdy kraj może pracować, każdy człowiek z każdego kraju może w innym kraju pracować.
And we have reached a situation in which a resident of one member state can work in any other member state within Europe.
Ale to jest koniec tej drogi.
But I guess this is the cul-de-sac. This is the end. We can't go any further at this point.
Stanęły podstawowe pytania.
Quite simply because we have not as yet answered the basic questions that need the answer.
Na jakich fundamencie chcemy osadzić tę nową budowlę Europy i świata?
What should serve as the new foundation for new integrated Europe and actually new globalized world?
Drugie pytanie, a jaki system ekonomiczny na tą epokę jest potrzebny?
And the second unanswered question is what economic system would be effective for this new era?
Na pewno nie komunizm, bo się nigdzie w żadnym kraju na świecie nie sprawdził.
Certainly not communism because it has not proven effective in even a single country throughout the world.
Ale na pewno też nie taki kapitalizm, jak obowiązywał w tamtej epoce.
But on the other hand, certainly not the kind of the capitalist system that we have witnessed in the world so far.
W tamtym kapitalizmie ścigaliśmy się. Każdy kraj co lepiej, taniej i więcej zarobił.
In the old capitalism, so to say, we raced ones against the other. We competed. We wanted to beat the others, whoever was faster, whoever was better.
Ktoś nazwał tę epokę wyścig szczurów między państwami.
Some referred to it as a rat's race among states.
Kiedy dziś tak się nie ścigamy, to połowy kapitalizmu odpada.
And I guess that once we no longer need to race against one another, we could forget about half of the content of the capitalist system as such.
A jak wygląda dziś demokracja?
Then another question can be asked regarding democracy today.
Mnie uczono, że demokracja jest z większością.
I was always taught that democracy is wherever the majority are.
A dziś większość w niektórych krajach nie chodzi na wybory.
Meanwhile, in most countries, the majority of people do not come to vote.
I jutro będą wchodzić tylko ci, co mają być wybierani, a reszta nie będzie chodzić.
And I can foresee the situation tomorrow when only those running for offices will be participating in elections. Nobody else will be interested.
A więc trzeba przeorganizować, inaczej zorganizować życie polityczne.
Which simply goes to say that we need to reform, reorganize our political life.
A więc w tym pokoleniu mamy wielkie zadania, a szczególnie Stany Zjednoczone.
So during the lifetime of this generation, we are really faced with an enormous challenge and the task. And the task is actually for the United States to handle it as well.
Poprowadzić tak epokę słowa, byśmy znaleźli odpowiedzi na dalszy rozwój Europy i świata.
To handle it, that means to lead both Europe and the world answering these questions so that we also know how to proceed with the future of Europe and the world.
Jeszcze raz powtarzam, zorganizowanie do końca XX wieku w tamtej epoce, prawie wszystkie zorganizowania nie pasują na dzisiejszy czas.
And let me make this point again. Almost none of the structures that proved effective and existed in the world until the end of the 20th century, none of them is effective today. They all need to be reformed.
Musimy wszystko zrobić, by Stany Zjednoczone odzyskały kierowanie światem.
We need to do everything we can for the United States to restore its leadership position in the world.
Bo inaczej może nas czekać tragedia światowa.
Or we might be faced with a real world disaster.
Chyba że Stany Zjednoczone nie chcą przewodzić światu, to niech oddadzą ten interes Polsce, my będziemy wiedzieli, co z tym zrobić.
Obviously, there may be a situation when the United States is unwilling to continue with its leadership position, but it can then share its position with Poland, and we will know how to handle the business.
Szanowni Państwo, przygotowałem się na dwa wystąpienia.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, members of the committee, I have prepared two different addresses.
Jedno wystąpienie na piśmie zostawiam Państwu. Kogo będzie interesować, to proszę bardzo korzystać.
One a little bit more detailed in writing, and I'm going to leave it with you for you to become acquainted with it, whoever wants to have a look at it.
Ale drugie to, które zrobiłem teraz bez przygotowania.
And the other one that's not properly written, the one I have just made.
Pierwsze zadanie nam się wspólnie udało.
Well, the first task that we had to face was a successful one.
Wydawało się, że to było trudne zadanie.
That task of bringing communism down seemed challenging, a difficult one.
Chodziło o zmianę systemu, zmianę układu powojennego.
We had to change the balance of power in the world that had been in the world since the end of the Second World War.
Ale dziś, kiedy patrzę, to te zadanie drugie jest naprawdę trudniejsze.
But today, when I'm looking at things from today's perspective, it seems that the challenge we are facing now is even tougher than the one 30 years ago.
A od tego zależy, jak będą mówić o tamtym zwycięstwie.
And actually, depending on the way how we handle this today's challenge, people will be assessing our victory from years back.
Albo dziękować nam za te zwycięstwa, albo przeklinać nas.
They will either be grateful to us for what we had done before, or they will curse us for that victory.
I mimo mojego wieku jeszcze się włączam w te lekkie budowania,
And
w epoce słowa.
despite my advanced age, I continue contributing to the construction of things in this era of the word.
Z tego, jak popatrzyłem na salę, to nie ma nikogo, kto był na tamtym moim wystąpieniu.
As I glanced through the participants today, there is nobody here who witnessed my address at the Congress 30 years ago.
Mam nadzieję, że... Mam nadzieję, że jeszcze na trzecie zdążę odpowiedzieć zaproszenie.
Well, I do hope I will be asked once again to address the Congress for the third time in the future.
Niech Pan Bóg błogosławi Ameryce i Polsce.
God bless America and God bless Poland. Thank you.
President Walesa, anyone that thought they were going to come and hear you speak today and thought you were just going to be nostalgic about the last 30 years was wrong.
Że pan będzie nostalgicznie wspominał te minione 30 lat się wszyscy
Yes.
pamiętają.
Yeah, I mean, what we got and what we appreciate is someone looking 30 years in the future and where we have to go. So we're so grateful for your courage and leadership back then. But we also, as a Congress and as a House Committee on Foreign Affairs, in a bipartisan way, will take your challenge and work as much as we can to be leaders in a multilateral and global world and accept our responsibility and we may not have to rely on Poland to carry the whole burden.
Polska nie będzie musiała tego całego ciężaru nieść.
And now, if we could, and we've been joined, and I ask unanimous consent that Ms. Captor rather, is with us for this hearing. Representative, we're going to break for about 3 minutes and have an opportunity for those that weren't here in the beginning to speak with and see the president. So if we could, we'll take a brief recess of about 5 minutes. Thank you.
A to gdzie, tu czy to?
Nie, no chyba tutaj. Tak.
That was good.
Żeby to będą osoby, które... Co? Przepraszam. O, tutaj osoby, które chcą podejść, mogą podejść.
Congresswoman Ann Wagner. I
Ja
represent
jestem kongresmenką
Missouri,
Ann
right in the
Wagner,
middle.
jestem z Missouri, tak, dokładnie w samym środku.
I will
just get this going without being too rude. The committee is back in order, and I'd like to take this opportunity to introduce our witnesses for the second panel. Ms. Melissa Hooper is a lawyer and a director of human rights and civil society programming at the Human Rights First organization. Thank you for joining us. Ms. Susan Cork is a senior fellow and director of the Bipartisan Transatlantic Democracy Group with the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Thank you for all your work as someone who, before I was ever in here, was involved in the German Marshall Fund. Mr. Nate Schenken is the Director of Special Research at Freedom House. Welcome. And Dr. Matthias is a Senior Fellow for Europe on the Council of Foreign Relations and an Assistant Professor of International Political Economy at Johns Hopkins University. It's a pleasure to have all of you here. I'll now go to Ms. Hooper for your statement.
Thank you very much. Good. Chairman Keating, Ranking Member Kinzinger, distinguished members of this committee, thank you for holding this hearing and for the opportunity to testify. This week, as we mark the fall of the Berlin Wall, many are noting that the celebration of 1989 has given way to worries about democracy in the same countries that were once models of liberal transformation. Democratic backsliding is problematic both because it harms the institutions that are the backbone of state resilience and good governance, and because as these institutions break down, this creates vulnerabilities for foreign malign influence. Since my co-panelists will address Turkey, I will focus on the two governments leading attacks on democratic norms and processes within the EU, Fidesz in Hungary and Law and Justice in Poland. The actions of these governments illustrate three overarching themes that characterize the current context within the alliance, particularly the EU. First, governments are mounting frontal attacks on their own constitutions and laws that form the basis of democratic governance. Prime Minister Orbán of Hungary has in many ways borrowed the strategies of Vladimir Putin as he has sought to lead a non-democratic movement within the EU. After winning a supermajority in 2010, Fidesz rewrote Hungary's constitution to give the executive greater power over the judiciary, politicize institutions, increase the number of seats on the Constitutional Court to add party loyalists, and legally curtailed the court's jurisdiction. In the last two national elections, Fidesz won 45% to 49% of the vote, but through restructuring of the electoral system, converted this into a two-thirds supermajority. In Poland in 2015, when Jarosław Kaczynski's Law and Justice Party came to power, they lacked a similar supermajority, so have simply ignored constitutional court decisions with which they disagree, such as one striking down rules limiting court functions. The Polish government has exerted executive control over nearly every judicial body, using various methods to force out, intimidate, and discipline judges. One judge was targeted because he allowed an investigation of a parliament budget vote that occurred while opposition lawmakers were locked out of the voting room. Second, governments are repurposing state institutions for personal gain. Just last week, investigative journalists at the New York Times illustrated how Orbán and Czech Prime Minister Babiš have used EU farm subsidies to fund a crony economy. These leaders cut deals and offer contracts to their close contacts, binding these actors to the source of their wealth, the political party in power. Friends of Orbán and Fidesz similarly bought up nearly all media outlets in Hungary. They then voluntarily consolidated 476 of them and donated them to the government, a move Hungary's anti-monopoly agency rubber-stamped. Today, the government controls roughly 90% of media countrywide. Outside of Budapest, the figure approaches 100%. Third, backsliding governments court foreign influence in ways not conducive to U.S. interests. Russian-supported illicit finance is coursing through European business and media markets, for example, through energy deals obtained without open tenders in Hungary and Bulgaria. Disinformation is rampant and even espoused as a tool by European governments. Last year, the Hungarian government invited the Russian-controlled International Investment Bank to move to Budapest, fueling concerns it could act as an intelligence-gathering base for Moscow and facilitate government money laundering. Budapest will provide diplomatic immunity for the building and all employees, and Schengen access to guests of the bank. Orbán has broken with the rest of the EU to support Turkey in its Syria offensive and has courted Huawei despite warnings from Secretary Pompeo about associated risks. But Congress has an important role to play in combating democratic backsliding. First, Congress must make its concerns known when a backsliding government acts against the values of NATO. A recent bipartisan Senate letter expressing concern over Hungary's downward democratic trajectory and its implications for U.S. interests, and a bipartisan House statement of concern about the curtailing of judicial independence, politicization of the judiciary, and attacks on free speech in Poland were superb examples. The bipartisan resolution on Hungary introduced in the House is another positive step. It could be updated to highlight additional recent developments. Second, Congress needs to appropriate funds to shore up democratic institutions within the alliance. Funding can be used defensively, for example, to combat disinformation, and affirmatively to provide core funding for the redevelopment of institutions. The reintroduction of Radio Free Europe in Hungary is a step in the right direction, but Congress should make sure it's adequately funded to compete with the Hungarian government's media machine. Third, Congress should consider legislating conditions on future support to these allies. Conditions could include acceptance of the anti-corruption oversight of the EU Public Prosecutor's Office, or compliance with the Court of Justice rulings on core rule of law matters. Finally, Congress should urge the administration to penalize bad actors, using accountability mechanisms such as Global Magnitsky to target individuals that are major sources of corruption and rights violations. These governments must hear from their allies that they have crossed the line and be warned that if they continue to undermine Allied security, there will be consequences. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Hooper. Ms. Cork.
Thank you. Chairman Keating, Ranking Member Kinzinger, distinguished members of this committee, thank you for holding this hearing and inviting me to testify. Members of this committee have been among the most principled voices in calling for a reinvigoration of democracy in the NATO alliance. This year, we're commemorating important milestones, NATO's 70th and 30 years since the fall of the Berlin Wall and the Velvet Revolution. These anniversaries could have marked the success of the Transatlantic project and the triumph of democracy. Instead, the sense of democratic inevitability that Europeans had taken for granted since 1989 has been interrupted. NATO's future is in danger, facing urgent challenges that require immediate attention and adaptation. At the same time, we should appreciate that America's alliance with Europe has been the backbone for peace, freedom, and liberal values for decades. I've spent the past 15 years, both in and out of government, working to defend and advance democracy in Europe, from Vladivostok to Paris. I helped found the Bipartisan Transatlantic Democracy Working Group as a platform to fight together for the defense of democracy, regardless of political differences. As we grapple with this era of authoritarian resurgence, it is important to humbly take stock of how we arrived at this point. We have learned some hard lessons along the way. Democracy is not a linear process. It can move forward and backward. Where elites failed to understand the drivers of discontent for people, the financial and refugee crises, the people rightly lost their trust. But this is not a time for gloom. Today is an important opportunity to think about how to prepare for the next 30 years. In taking a stock of where we are, there are two primary external threats, Russia and China. Moscow has presented a threat to NATO since its inception, and it has only grown more aggressive. Russia and China have joined in a marriage of convenience, jointly interested in undermining the strength and cohesion of the Transatlantic Alliance. But it is the threats within that NATO has been less prepared to deal with. Illiberalism is a cancer that weakens our security. Prominent illustrations include Turkey's descent into authoritarianism, Poland and Hungary's illiberal regression. We'll all, I think, be talking about Hungary, Poland, and Turkey today, and endemic corruption in certain NATO states. But Poland and Hungary are not Russia or Turkey. Journalists and opposition don't fear jail, violence, or death. And friends in both places urge us not to give up on them. There are signs of hope. In Hungary, where there has been a one-party chokehold, the opposition managed to unify and have breakthrough wins in recent elections, including in Budapest. I'll give you 5 quick reasons why authoritarianism creates a danger for NATO and American security. 1, as Melissa discussed, NATO states are letting Russia in the back door. The International Investment Bank is something we should be very concerned about, as it could be a front for Russian intelligence. And Turkey is making big military deals with Russia. 2, corruption and organized crime. Many countries in NATO are rife with corruption, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, to name a few. Where corruption is allowed to flourish and is orchestrated by the government, there's a decline in citizen trust, stalled economic growth, and risks to security. 3, where Europe's autocrats look east, this signals a loss of American influence. In the past year, there has been a curious deepening of the relationship between Hungary and China. As Orban's regime was in the process of expelling Central European University, a joint American-Hungarian institution, despite American requests, there was a new academic partnership being developed between Hungary and China. Perhaps it was coincidental. Hungary has repeatedly scuttled NATO's efforts to build a closer relationship with Ukraine. Orban has shown he's willing to sacrifice actual security concerns for its Russian partner and its own ethnic politics. 5th, anti-Semitism is the canary in the coal mine. We know the dangers that can be unleashed by hatred of the other, especially when it's stoked at the top. So what can be done? I'll conclude by sharing a few recommendations from the Democracy Playbook, which I just launched with scholars at the Brookings Institution. This report highlights strategies to not only push back on authoritarianism, but also to renew the resiliency of democratic institutions. 1, U.S. must lead in NATO by example and by encouraging NATO members to adhere to democratic principles. We must value our allies. 2, make defending rule of law and fighting corruption a legitimate and integrated part of our bilateral and multilateral relationships. 3, change a narrative that is no longer working. Democracy is a process, not a destination. It must be nurtured. We must be alert to early warnings. 4, to support democracy, the U.S. needs an adapted funding model and one that goes local. The graduation model of democracy assistance fails to address those that are in regression. This must include support for civil society, independent media, including Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and people-to-people exchanges. We shouldn't wait for a full-blown democratic crisis to invest in capacity building and building lines of communication and capacity beyond the capitals. 5, we need to invest more in cyber defense and technology preparedness. And finally, 6, we need to better prepare for what a rising China will mean for the Transatlantic Alliance. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Schenken.
Thank you, Chairman Keating. Ranking Member Kinzinger, members of the subcommittee, it's an honor to testify before you today. In certain ways, the NATO alliance has become stronger since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. There are no doubts now about the relevance of the alliance's mission in Europe, and the enhanced forward presence has helped reassure the easternmost members of the alliance. The alliance still faces significant challenges, however. There remain disagreements among members about the appropriate stance towards Russia, for instance, as seen in some of the outreach by President Macron of France recently. In addition, the current U.S. administration has at times undermined the alliance's cohesion by sending mixed messages about its commitment. But the gravest threat to the alliance, as stated by the other witnesses, is the assault on democratic institutions in some of its member states, which threatens the basis for long-term alignment and deep cooperation. In the case of one member, Turkey, about which I will primarily speak, this process of democratic backsliding or autocratization has already caused a major break with the alliance. Democratic rollback in Turkey dates back over a decade, but it picked up momentum in 2013 with the crackdown on the Gezi Park protests and against corruption investigations, and then it accelerated further as President Erdogan drove to change the constitution to a super-presidential system. A crackdown on Erdogan's former allies in the Gulen movement, as well as on civil society and Kurdish activists, was already well underway when there was an attempted coup on July 15, 2016. The backlash to the coup attempt devastated Turkey's media, civil sector, and political scene. Hundreds of media outlets have been closed, over 1,000 civic organizations have been shuttered, the leaders of the People's Democratic Party, the HDP, are in prison, well over 100 journalists and media workers are in jail, and civil society leader Osman Kavala will soon be entering his 3rd year of pretrial detention, imprisoned without conviction. In this atmosphere of repression, Erdogan pushed through his constitutional changes nonetheless, even while Turkey was under a state of emergency. The result is a hyper-concentrated system in which the president wields unchecked authority over the military, the government, and the judiciary. Turkey still has a pluralistic political environment, and strong traditions of electoral competition, strong enough that the government was unable to prevent a wave of opposition from winning in local elections this year, although not for lack of trying. Meanwhile, the damage has already been done to Turkey's role in NATO. With this successful autocratization has come a turn to reliance on Russia. Ankara has chosen to procure a Russian S-400 missile defense system despite ample opportunities to purchase systems made by NATO allies. President Erdogan's personal embrace of conspiracy theories and repeated, even daily, accusations against European and American allies have made sustaining cooperation difficult. The unfortunate truth is that as a result, although Turkey will remain a member of NATO, it is likely to be increasingly compartmentalized within the alliance in the coming years, and the US and NATO will need to replace its role in the transatlantic security architecture. My colleagues have already spoken about Hungary and Poland, so I will have very brief remarks on them, but I want to emphasize, first of all, of course, that the autocratizations underway in these countries are not as complete nor as violent as what we've seen in Turkey. However, in Hungary, we also see threats in terms of divergence from the alliance's shared interests. These raise questions about whether Prime Minister Orban and his party Fidesz are pursuing a multi-vector policy of the type more commonly seen in Central Asia, where they seek to court different patrons in order to maximize advantage. Warsaw remains strongly committed to NATO and by virtue of its geographic position and history, far less likely to entertain either a departure from the alliance, such as Turkey has embarked on, or a multi-vector approach like what Hungary is attempting. Nonetheless, the democratic erosion in Poland in the last several years raises real concerns for the future. The extra-constitutional maneuvers have severely undermined rule of law in Poland, and undoing that damage will be a steep task. Furthermore, the brazenness of the changes in Hungary and Poland may provide a roadmap for other parties who wish to dismantle checks and balances and reduce accountability and transparency. This is the deeper threat to NATO that these undemocratic trends present. If it becomes normalized that a single party can remove the principles of liberal democracy from the system of government, we could see single-party states become ensconced throughout the alliance. And where the party merges with the state, national interests are replaced by the individual interests of those in power. And this makes durable, long-lasting alliances more difficult to sustain because cooperation comes to depend on following the whims of a leader instead of long-term alignment based on values. Now, some very brief recommendations as my time is up. On Turkey, we do not support new sanctions initiatives tied to the most recent incursion because there are already existing sanctions under law that should be applied, namely those pertaining to the S-400 and the Halkbank Iran sanctions busting case. In addition, Congress should make a major investment in supporting democracy in Turkey by appropriating significant funds to support democratic activists, civil society, and independent media. Regarding Poland and Hungary, the US should be firm and consistent about what it stands for and what its values are. Freezing out anti-democratic leaders with non-engagement will not work, but neither will coddling them by ignoring attacks on democratic institutions. And when it speaks, the US should speak with one voice. And to buttress that engagement, the United States should return to democracy promotion activities in Central and Eastern Europe, replacing the graduation model that some of my colleagues mentioned. So make no mistake, geopolitical competition is real. NATO and the United States face strategic threats from Russia and China, but upholding democratic institutions strengthens, not weakens, our ability to compete. Our strength is the transparency, accountability, and adaptability of our system of government. It will never be perfect, but it is definitely superior because it is inclusive, because it is accountable to its citizens, and because it allows us to find deeper forms of cooperation that go beyond zero-sum calculations. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Matisse.
Yes, thank you for the invitation, also to discuss the subject of democracy in the NATO alliance and the importance of upholding our shared democratic values. This, I think, is going to be a panel of rare agreement on some of the developments that we've seen in the three countries, particularly Turkey, Hungary, and Poland. So I think what I'll do is focus more on the role the European Union and the role NATO has played and what they can do to address this. So over the last decade, we have seen significant and troubling democratic backsliding among certain NATO members. Indeed, some member states of NATO can no longer be described as liberal democracies today, but would instead fall under the broad rubric of what some label illiberal democracies, but what are often, I think, better understood as competitive authoritarian regimes. So such regimes, while they're free national elections. They're not fair. The outcome is all but guaranteed. Most checks and balances on executive power are gone. Judiciary is no longer independent, as judges are directly appointed by the executive. Laws are mostly rubber stamped by the legislature. Media freedoms are weakened, often through the buying up of existing media outlets by regime-friendly businesses or outright closures. Civil society organizations are stifled and academic freedoms are seriously limited. I think it's fair to say that Turkey and Hungary today already fit in the category of competitive authoritarian regimes, while Poland has been gradually moving in that direction. But before I address the three cases, I want to make 2 points of context. This has not been an easy decade for democracy around the world. Right? Many political scientists, including myself, speak of a democratic malaise, while Larry Diamond of Stanford University speaks of a full-blown democratic recession. My colleague here, Nate Schenken from Freedom House, since 2006, Freedom House has systematically downgraded more countries on democratic scores than they have upgraded countries. That is very different compared to the 1990s and the 2000s. So while there are certain cases of democratic backsliding in NATO that should worry us deeply, including the current path both Hungary and Poland are on, it needs to be emphasized, I think, that Central and Eastern Europe is a very diverse and a very complicated place. Right? The same trend is by no means visible in every country. For every Poland and every Hungary, there is an Estonia and a Slovenia. Indeed, the latter two countries, Estonia and Slovenia, achieved higher democracy scores in 2019 from Freedom House than the United States, the United Kingdom, and France. So how has democratic backsliding manifested itself in Turkey, Hungary, and Poland? I think my fellow panelists have already addressed this better than I can. So let me focus on the role of the European Union and NATO. In the case of Turkey, the EU has played an indirect role. As the erosion of democracy in Ankara accelerated, the EU has responded by slowing down and then freezing most accession negotiations. Even though Turkey formally remains an applicant for EU membership, however, the prospect of membership has never been more distant since Turkey first formally applied in 1987. Furthermore, the cash for refugees deal Angela Merkel's Germany concluded on behalf of the EU with the Erdogan regime to keep most Syrian refugees on Turkish soil with substantial EU financial support also forces the EU to tread very carefully when it comes to criticizing the regime for what Ankara will mostly see as internal political affairs. But according to my colleague Dan Kellerman at Rutgers University, the EU has contributed indirectly to the consolidation of both Orban's Fidesz regime and Kaczynski PIS regime in Poland by three factors. First is, ironically, party politics at the European level. Since Orban's Fidesz is a member of the European People's Party, Angela Merkel and Jean-Claude Juncker's party, they have a much harder time criticizing him because they need his votes at the European Parliament. European Union funds, we're talking about close to $500 billion of aid for much of Eastern Europe that used to be used for democracy promotion, that now sadly is being used to prop up these autocratic regimes. And third, I think more sinister in a way, an indirect consequence of the single market is emigration, right? What we've seen in Hungary, and I think that's the most striking, up to 500,000 Hungarians have left in just the last 10 years. That's the equivalent of 20 million Americans leaving the United States. And they found jobs all over the European Union. These tend to be younger, these tend to be the more skilled voters who support opposition forces. So, although NATO's founding charter mentions the principles of democracy, individual liberty, and the rule of law, it has really no mechanism for responding to or sanctioning behavior that is not in line with those values. And I don't recommend them do it that anyway. So what can the United States and the European Union do about this? Well, both the United States through NATO and our European allies through the European Union should do more to encourage common values like the rule of law and democracy in Turkey, Hungary, and Poland. While it may be hard to achieve concrete result in the very short term, both organizations should be aware that they are playing a longer game and that none of the three current leaders in Ankara, Budapest, and Warsaw will be in power indefinitely. While lecturing allies and friends on democratic principles may easily backfire and be quickly condemned as hypocrisy, the US especially should stand by its enduring commitment to democratic freedoms and the rule of law in all its official and obviously unofficial foreign policy statements. So going forward, let me just make 2 points that what the United States could do, as I'm running out of time myself. They should continue to support civil society groups and free media in countries experiencing democratic backsliding. Secondly, emphasize that NATO membership means rights as well as responsibilities beyond the 2% GDP on defense spending. NATO must be an alliance based on common democratic values. The Transatlantic alliance has proven so strong and enduring, not simply because of realpolitik, but also because it has been an alliance based on a shared commitment to freedom and democratic values. If those values are no longer seen as common to the alliance, it will inevitably erode. One final thought. Despite what some scholars have argued, the popular appeal of liberal democracy remains undiminished around the world. Voters' attitudes, young or old, have not changed in fundamental ways. What has changed is many politicians' willingness to tap into their voters' fears by offering simple solutions to often very complex problems. Thank you very much.
I'd like to thank the panel. Hearing your testimony, hearing President Walesa's testimony, we even look at the title of today's hearing and references to backsliding. I don't think it fully grasps the magnitude of what's happening. Backsliding is such a more comfortable term. President Walesa, and your testimony really underscores the fact that this is more than backsliding that we're looking at. A couple of thoughts, if I could, among many, but one of them is this. You know, the leaders that are here, the U.S. and France, let me give those two examples. In France, you know, President Macron is talking about, you know, state-by-state militarization, and that indirectly is an attack at NATO, I believe, whether it's intentional or whether it's motivated to prod us forward in the U.S., I'm not sure. And also, today, President Erdogan is getting a White House meeting on the heels of their actions that occurred at the Syrian border. And so, what, if you could just briefly, what kind of images do these two different actions take, and how could that be harmful? I mean, if you could. I think it's important that we talk to each other as countries. I think it's important for countries to be concerned about commitments, but it really helps weaken things. So either Ms. Cork or Ms. Shankin, you touched on some of those things. Just briefly, how damaging can this be or not?
If I may respond on Turkey in particular, it's quite damaging. The position of President Erdogan domestically in Turkey has in fact been weakening in the face of a serious economic crisis that he has brought on his own self, through his own mismanagement of the economy and his very aggressive actions towards his allies and his mismanagement of the war in Syria. And the result was these very catastrophic losses for his party in local elections earlier this year. And so when the United States invites a president to meet with our president, it shores him up. It shows support for him and for his actions, including at a time when he is literally imprisoning journalists by the dozens. When we had a journalist who was released last week, Ahmet Altan, after 3 years in prison, who was then rearrested yesterday on the same charges. When we have mayors being removed from office unilaterally by the Interior Ministry and being replaced with so-called trustees all over the southeast of Turkey. It sends, if at minimum, acquiescence, if not approval, of those kinds of actions.
Even beyond their own countries, I think. I was really focused on what messages send to the rest of the NATO allies, you know, when they're viewing these things.
Well, I think, thank you for your question. I think that President Macron has been rather unhelpful with his comments, in particular the timing of it right before the London NATO summit. You know, it's one of those don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. We all acknowledge that NATO is at a difficult point in time and it needs to adapt, but it has adapted before, and I think it can do so again. You know, there's been a lot of talk of European strategic autonomy, which also then goes against NATO. This idea of state-by-state militarization, you know, is sort of a dangerous direction to go in. You know, I was at an event the other day on German strategic culture, and you know, there's a reason why all of our institutions were developed the way that they were post-World War II. That we decided that collective defense was the way to keep us all stronger together. One of the things within NATO, there's very few mechanisms to hold member states accountable. to their obligations within NATO, but meeting with leaders as they are in the middle of a full-scale crackdown on rule of law, finding ways to, within NATO, to, for example, not host a major meeting within a NATO state where there's been concerns about rule of law. I think on an individual bilateral basis, the leaders within NATO, France or the United States, when Viktor Orban was coming to the United States and visiting in the White House, there was a lot of concern that, one, he was blatantly undermining his commitments. Two, the United States was not getting very much out of that relationship. I mentioned Central Europe.
Okay, if I could quickly, because I'm just running out of time,
Yes.
and I hate to take an issue like this as a yes or no, but one thing I honestly think we should be working towards, free trade agreement for economic strength and solidarity with the European Union as a whole. Do you think that would have a major impact, or am I overstating the potential for that, increasing our security and actually dealing with some of these issues? Just a yes or a no, if I could. Super.
Yes.
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 Okay, I yield to the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you again all for being here. Somebody had mentioned, kind of why we see this decline, and I forget which one of you mentioned about fear, using fear. I think Mr. Shanken. And I think that's huge. I think people have figured out that fear motivates votes, and frankly, people feel like it's a miserable time to be alive, and it's actually really the best time in the world ever to be alive. And but it's new media. It's going on the internet and seeing everything that you don't have, and every terrible thing that happens around the world is presented to you every time you go on, and eventually that has an impact. And I think people feel tired, and the real question I think you have to ask yourself is, tired of what? What's been so exhausting about being free? And if that's something in your own life, then maybe make changes. And I think that's what you're seeing right now in the whole NATO alliance is it's not necessarily that Russia isn't an enemy anymore, because I would argue that they are. And in fact, in many cases, even more unpredictable than they were when there was the Soviet Union. But it's this idea of using fear, and it tears apart, and there's disagreements, and politics is the new god to everybody, and it creates major issues. So, Mr. Matisse, I do want to ask you about the democratic erosion, specifically when you talk about NATO and our EU allies. How does that impact our national security? And do you believe, for instance, Turkey is willing to fulfill its duties and obligations to the NATO alliance?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. So it's part of my written statement, and so let me just quickly read out what I would have said on this. I think it, and some of my fellow panelists have said it, I think it does play into the hands of Vladimir Putin's Russia and even China, right? You could call them Trojan horses or something like this, especially Orban and to a lesser extent the Kaczynski regime in Poland. You could say that Russia has been actively encouraging those anti-democratic tendencies, spreading misinformation, supporting those regimes by coordination of foreign policies. But over the long term, I think there's other international strategic competitors of the US, such as China, that can be expected to exploit any divisions over democratic values within NATO as well, right? And so they see these increasingly authoritarian regimes within NATO as something to exploit, and it will, I think, cultivate closer ties with and greater leverage over such regimes. We see this with China's strategic investment in much of southeastern Europe and kind of closer alignments with those regimes. I think that's stuff that should worry us.
And I mean, look at it, I blame this administration and I blame the last administration, and maybe, I mean, who knows how far back. But the reality is, when you're the United States of America, when you're the world's sole superpower and you're competing against a potential another superpower in China and a great power in Russia, you've got to play ball a little harder, and you also have to play ball economically. And in a time when protectionism is actually being embraced everywhere right now, China is doing the opposite. We know that, for instance, in New Zealand, there's a real desire for a free trade agreement with the United States because they see the impact of China. You see that in Eastern Europe. I mentioned Georgia in my opening statement. Is it going to greatly benefit the U.S.? No, not a ton. It's not going to hurt us, but it will send a very strong message, for instance, in that region where you can either send goods through Russia or through Iran. And if you empower Georgia to be that ally, then it would be very beneficial. And you'll send a strong message again to the rest of the alliance, which is the United States isn't going anywhere, we're here, and you have a choice to make. You can either align with China, that's fine, it's your choice as an independent nation, but it's going to cost you your ability to align with the United States. I'm sure a lot of people are going to ask questions about Turkey, so I'm going to skip the rest of mine, but I do want to ask you, Mr. Matisse, about a non-NATO country specifically, if you would be able to answer this. Earlier this week, Moldova's coalition government collapsed after losing a no-confidence vote in Parliament. What does this mean for the country and the region as far as you're concerned, and whether it's Russia or anything else?
I would love to answer this question, Congressman Kinzinger, but I know next to nothing about Moldova.
Okay.
But I could probably yield that to Mr. Schenk.
Yeah, go ahead then, sir.
I'm drawing on the internal knowledge at Freedom House from some of my colleagues who work on Moldova, so I apologize. The coalition collapse, I think, is a disappointment for reformist forces in Moldova, pro-European, pro-Western forces in Moldova, who had hoped to use this coalition as a means to bring some much-needed reforms, especially in the judicial sector, but across the board in Moldova. So it is a disappointment that that coalition didn't have a chance to work through those issues in its own time. At the same time, we will have new elections, so we will have another opportunity. I wouldn't take it as, I don't think we would take it as a complete collapse of any kind of opportunity in Moldova to continue, or rather, to still take the opportunity for reform progress that was brought by the exiling of the oligarch Vladimir Plahotniuc, who was running the country, pushing him out. We still have that window of opportunity, and we have to keep pushing forward on it.
Great, thank you. I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Series.
Thank you, Chairman, for holding this hearing. Very interesting. Not just in the members of NATO that we have a backsliding democracy. It seems like the Western Hemisphere is also experiencing. And the same players that are playing in the NATO members are playing in the Western Hemisphere, which is Russia, China. But getting back to the NATO members, when a country who's a member of NATO doesn't have the strategic priorities of the members of NATO, what can be done about it? What can you do if they all of a sudden their interest is not necessarily the same interest as the members of NATO? I think that we're talking about Turkey. It doesn't seem that the goals of members of NATO are the same ones as Turkey. So what do you do? Anybody wants to?
I know that Nate will talk about Turkey, but I think that the U.S. needs to think about its partnerships then and think about its bilateral relationship with whatever country is perhaps not sharing its interests or seems to not be sharing those interests. There are situations where the U.S. has, for example, limited intelligence sharing with certain countries. And there may be other limitations on the relationship. I think that Nate used the word compartmentalization. And so looking at that relationship and identifying where the risks are and then trying to limit those risks is important for the U.S.
Absolutely, thank you, Melissa. And I would add to that, and I believe this has already in some sense begun for the United States vis-a-vis Turkey, is there's a repositioning, right, away from dependence on Turkey in terms of geographic location and basing and these kinds of issues. It's especially complicated with Turkey because Turkey is in such an important location, but it's not impossible. There are other allies along the Black Sea. There are other allies in the Eastern Mediterranean. There are other allies in the Middle East. It's not a good situation. I don't think anyone wants to be in it. but it's a situation that can be addressed, and I think that's the only way to do it, is to patiently and consciously embark on plans to work around it.
So in other words, do not participate in many of the things that we participate up to now. Cut them out.
Correct. There will be a loss. There's a loss to all of this. This is not a positive situation. It's not something, again, I don't think that anyone would have wanted on the U.S. side.
If I may, NATO as a military organization is, of course, not the leading actor in addressing democratic challenges, but because member states have committed to strengthening their free institutions, we do need to think about how to adapt NATO to meet current challenges that are these hybrid challenges from Russia, where they are able to find a backdoor. A couple of ideas that I think should be explored. One would be to create a commission or a special ombudsman's office within or connected to NATO that would be responsible for identifying violations of alliance principles. Alternatively, there could be an external body that consists of representatives from the European Union, NATO, OSCE, that address threats together and think about what are the various tools that are possible. But at a minimum, NATO needs to enhance its own ability to respond when there's concerns. The Secretary General has a role to play here, and NATO should continue to bolster its communique language regarding the importance of democracy. We can't just let what's happening in Turkey just be kind of shoved aside and said, well, they're a good NATO ally. The reason why we're talking about democracy in the context of NATO is because it's a shared alliance that the United States is part of, and it affects our security. So therefore, there needs to be a way to talk about concerns about NATO member states going against the founding commitments.
Thank you.
Mr. Joe Wilson of South Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank each of you for being here today. And I actually share the very positive point of view of Congressman Kinzinger, and that is that we should be rejoicing. It was 30 years ago that the Berlin Wall fell. I'm of age to remember where it was supposed to be there forever. In fact, it was the wave of the future. Get used to it. And so how incredible that the collapse occurred. And then I've had the opportunity to live it. As he mentioned, the Republic of Georgia. Who would ever imagine? I was in Gori, the birthplace of Stalin. Times have changed in such a positive way. And now Georgia is such a great ally of the United States. They actually have more combat troops in Afghanistan per capita than any other country on earth. And what a great ally they are, even before becoming a part of NATO. And then I had the opportunity to be an election observer June 10, 1990, in Bulgaria, to see the country come to life. When I got there, Mr. Chairman, it was like stepping back in the 1930s. It was horrible. And now when I go back every 2 or 3 years, 2 years ago, I appreciate Prime Minister Boyko Borisov celebrating my birthday at his office with a bottle of Bulgarian wine. And so how times have changed and what a modern society Bulgaria is today. And then I had the opportunity to visit the Berlin Wall on June 12, 1990. It was a real honor for me, Mr. Chairman. The East German police wouldn't let me cross at the Brandenburg Gate. They told me I had to cross at Friedrichstrasse. And so I took it as a compliment. I did. I went to Checkpoint Charlie, and I got one of the final passport stamps of GDR, German Democratic Republic. The next week, it was fun to see a crane take Checkpoint Charlie away. And then to visit countries that didn't exist, to Slovakia, the heart of Europe. What a beautiful country, Bratislava, countries that have come to life. And then Romania. I'm really grateful that Cluj-Napoca is the sister city of Columbia, South Carolina, that I represent. And so we have so much to be grateful for, and to me, it's a dream come true. I'm going to show my political heritage, Mr. Chairman, and that is that I was an early supporter as a very young guy for Barry Goldwater, and he wrote a book. It was called Why Not Victory? And I've got that book. It cost all of 75 cents. But it was Why Not Victory in the Cold War, and to promote freedom and democracy over communism, and of course he was perceived as not mentally stable. But the bottom line was his view of why not victory has come to fruition. With that, Ms. Cork, you correctly have expressed concern about corruption. And what I'm concerned about is too often people, when they disagree, accuse each other of being corrupt. And this is for you and actually each one of you, a brief definition of what corruption is, what we should be looking for in any country. And I'd like for you to begin, and then we go to Ms. Hooper and come back over.
Sure. Thank you for the question. I mean, corruption is throughout Europe, and there's a couple of countries that are particularly bad actors. But in the context of what we're talking about, I'd say corruption is the abuse of public money by a select few in power that impoverishes the rest of the country and holds back progress. So it is the incorrect use of funding by political leaders that corrupts the system and the ability to govern, takes money that should be spent for the public good and uses it for the private good of a select few. That's the definition of corruption.
Thank you. And Ms. Hooper?
I would agree. I believe that processes that we're seeing that include bribery or procurement processes that are limited tenders or not open or public tenders are some of the things, some of the methods that we're seeing that are problematic in the countries that we're speaking about.
Yeah, I would agree. I think the definition could be given as abuse of public authority for personal interest. So using one's office to direct resources towards one's family members, a company that's controlled by yourself or by your family or your close associates. These are the kinds of abuses we're talking about.
And Dr. Mateus?
I don't disagree with any of these definitions. I think it mostly comes down to abuse of power. Right? What I will say to your earlier comments is that it is striking that the countries that democratized the fastest, that were held up as examples, Hungary and Poland for sure, but even Turkey in the early 2000s have seen the fastest decline. And I would say that maybe in the 1990s, much of the focus was on economic liberalization and not enough on building lasting political institutions.
Thank you very much. And indeed, with Turkey going back to 1923, they have always been a model of democracy. And how disappointing it is under the new regime that what has been such a great ally of America and a great positive country has been thwarted. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank the gentleman, and thank you for the unexpected, introducing Senator Goldwater into this discussion. I think that's great. That's what makes these hearings great. Mr. Costa of California.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. This is an important and timely hearing by the subcommittee, given what's taking place in the larger discussion with Ukraine and our consistency of a foreign policy, or, in my opinion, the lack thereof. Democracy, NATO alliance, and upholding our shared democratic values is the title of this afternoon's hearing. I would add to that the importance of the rule of law and the fact of how that's benefited Western Europe and its expansion in our own interests, in our common interests. A number of us met with the Secretary General today, and I asked him what he was most concerned about in NATO's ability to move in the 21st century to provide that protection. A lot of people forget that this last 70-year anniversary of NATO is the longest peacetime period in Europe in 1,000 years. And when you think about it in that context, you understand the importance. To the NATO Secretary General's comments, his concern about the uncertainties in the world we live in today, how prepared do you think NATO is today to handle these uncertainties, given the changes and the backsliding in Poland and Hungary and Turkey? Who would like to address that first?
I think that's a difficult question. That's what we're all grappling with here. Of course, NATO is in some ways united and in some ways continues to function.
But when President Macron makes the statement he did today, as all of you thought was ill-timed, And our president has, at best, been inconsistent about his support for NATO over the last 2 years. That inconsistency, doesn't that impact the backsliding that's taking place in Poland and Hungary and Turkey?
Yes, I think that the United States, as a leading country within NATO, needs to be clear and needs to have a cohesive
Dr. Mathias, do you think we've been
concern.
clear and consistent in our foreign policy over the last several years?
I think the foreign policy message of the United States could have been more consistent over the last 10 years. But what I will say is that with the end of the Cold War and the expansion of NATO, it's a much bigger alliance, many more countries, and it, by definition, is going to be much less coherent. That we see this in the European Union.
And how do we
well.
address that?
I think democracy and the title of today's panel is what has kept us together. And so when this gets undermined in certain countries, I think this is, as somebody else said, this is a cancer that can spread.
Mr. Shankin, you care to comment?
I would stress, as I did in the testimony as well, that I think NATO is, in fact, in some areas, as an institution, in a better place than it was 6 or 7 years ago because of the shock that came from the invasion of Ukraine that has resulted in the enhanced forward presence in.
Well, let's talk about
allies.
the Ukraine here. With currently the debate that's going on as to whether or not we as a NATO ally withhold potential support and aid to a country that would like to become a part of the European Union, might like to become a part of NATO. What does that tell the rest of our European allies? What does it tell when we're addressing with Turkey's president in the United States today, and basically, in my view, giving a green light in northern Syria as we pulled back our troops and then allowed Turkey to basically do what they wanted to do?
I think the situation regarding withholding of military aid to Ukraine sent a very negative signal. I think that was an opinion shared as well in parts of the administration.
And how about the action of the troops in Syria?
I think the troops have behaved honorably and admirably. I think the action to approve the Turkish incursion, which is what happened.
No, that's what I'm talking about.
Yeah, I think that was shameful, and I think it was
And what kind of signal did that give to our NATO allies?
I think that is part of what President Macron is responding to.
And what's that tell to the folks, the authoritarians in Poland and Hungary and Turkey?
I think it is sending a signal perhaps that the U.S. is not going to be as reliable as it has been in the past and as consistent as it has been in the past.
Final question here, my time's running out. I co-chair the Transatlantic Legislators Dialogue, which the chair here and other members of the subcommittee participate in. We're going to have 2 meetings next year, one here and one in Europe. What would you suggest that we put on the agenda to meet? We've got, 2/3 of the European Parliament is now new. This is important as they try to set their own policy. What should be our items on the agenda for next year?
Briefly, I would suggest the links between rule of law and security issues.
Rule of law and security, yes. Next.
I think that there should be a consideration or a strategic consideration of how to address cyber and technology threats. How does NATO come together and develop the collective capacity and political will to deal with new threats?
Mr. Schenken?
I'll co-sign with Melissa's recommendation, rule of law and security.
Okay, you're batting cleanup.
Finally, I think you can link rule of law to trade, right? I mean,
Trade.
the biggest opportunity for the United States and the European Union is to sign a trade deal that will set global standards, which both will benefit from.
While we still control about half the world's economy and
While you-
can establish the rules of law, that will not continue throughout the 21st century, I suspect.
Agreed.
One more, if I could. How to deal with China. I've heard a lot of discussions when I've traveled over in Europe, and there seems to be a lot of acknowledgement that there's a need to have a coherent policy, a transatlantic policy towards China, but that's something that needs to be discussed in more detail.
No, and our European friends bring that up all the time, and the Secretary General of NATO said I could talk a lot about China because they are very concerned. Thank you. My time has obviously expired, Mr. Chairman. You've been very kind.
Ms. Ann Wagner, Missouri.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It was such an honor to have President Wałęsa with us earlier. Under his leadership, the Polish people won an inspiring victory over totalitarianism, and were instrumental in ushering in a new era of liberty and democracy. For centuries, Poland has been a friend to the United States. Few other nations have stood so strongly for freedom and independence. And I have to say, I'm a little bit saddened to see some of our European partner nations, including Poland, drift towards authoritarianism. We must protect the democratic nature of the NATO alliance. Dr. Matees, I worry that some former Soviet bloc countries are frustrated by the continued prosperity gap between Western Europe and Central and Eastern Europe, and might be attracted, speaking of China, to China's model of autocratic economic growth. Where do you see China expanding its ties to Europe, and how might democratic backsliding be connected to the growth of Chinese influence in Europe?
That's an excellent question, Congresswoman. Thank you for that. I would point out that what's kept the regimes in Hungary and Poland in place and actually re-elected a few times is democratic prosperity, right? I mean, they have delivered on economic growth to a much bigger extent than Western Europe. Neither Hungary nor Poland are members of the Eurozone, so they've had the flexible exchange rates, but they've had faster growth. I mean, quite astonishing growth. They've also both had an effort in renationalizing much of their economies. Don't forget, in the 1990s, a lot of their opening up attracted a lot of foreign direct investment, especially in the financial sector, which they've reversed, right? So there are choices that they made, particularly economically. They've seen a bit of a brain drain, right? So that naturally, I mean, this is a problem we see in the United States too, right? I mean, there's certain states that see their young and their most able leave for other states, and so European Union sees that too. And so there is an older population that's probably frustrated with this, but I think China has played into this. You see a lot of foreign direct investment in those parts, but also these regimes have attracted it.
I agree. That's very, very concerning, the Chinese influence in Europe in particular, and this democratic backsliding that I think we're seeing throughout. President Wałęsa mentioned in his written testimony that democratic backsliding makes Poland more vulnerable geopolitically because it increases the risk of interference by foreign actors. Ms. Hooper, can you assess Poland's vulnerability in this regard, and how are malign foreign powers like Russia seeking to exploit democratic backsliding in Poland?
Well, I would say that Poland is different from Hungary and Turkey in that it is remains very anti-Russian, and the government remains anti-Russian. However, the problem occurs when you see the government there espousing some of the methods that you have seen in autocratic regimes. For example, undermining its constitutional court such that the court is not functioning anymore,
right,
or adopting messages that the Polish government actually uses in its own disinformation campaigns that are very similar to messages that Russia would use in Poland. So while you don't see a great deal of Russian influence in Poland, I think you do start to see a dismantling of democratic checks and balances, which is problematic.
Mr. Schenken, what direct means of Russian influence can you identify in Turkey's political system? How should this inform U.S. democracy promotion activities in Europe?
In the Turkish case, there has been a building issue of Russian influence. Much of that is direct in the sense of person-to-person, almost, between President Erdogan and President Putin. And that's how we've seen the negotiations proceed over the missile defense system.
Yes.
That's how we saw the negotiations proceed over Turkstream, which is the energy pipeline that replaced South Stream after it was axed. Especially in the latter, there are significant concerns about corruption. Because large energy projects, large energy infrastructure projects frequently have ample opportunities for corruption, and Mr. Erdogan's family is involved in the energy sector. These are very significant issues for Russian influence. In addition, I would add the media area. Russia has amped up its disinformation and propaganda efforts in Turkish for Turkish audiences, and we've seen impacts of that over the past couple of years with its ability to disseminate narratives, essentially replicating the Russian model we've seen elsewhere of sowing division, sowing dissent, and advancing Russian interests through propaganda.
Thank you, Mr. Schenken. I have run out of time, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your indulgence, and I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Susan Weil from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Hooper, I have some questions for you about the Turkish government, and what I'm going to do is just kind of combine my questions and then give you some time to respond to them all. In your testimony, you state that the actions of the Turkish government present a particularly dramatic case of increased autocracy and a crackdown on democracy. It's clear from President Erdogan's actions during the last decade, and particularly from the recent invasion into northern Syria, that President Erdogan wants to consolidate his power and crack down on any opposition to his leadership. So my questions to you, and you can answer them in whatever fashion you see fit. I'm looking for guidance from you as to what Congress and the administration need to do to encourage the Turkish government to reverse course. How can NATO provide support to Turkey and its people to encourage them to reestablish democratic principles in the country and to provide support if Turkey wishes to return to democratic norms? How much longer do you think President Erdogan will dominate Turkish politics? And what do you think the future of the government there would look like if his power diminishes? And finally, if you have time, could you discuss the increasingly close relationship between Turkey and Russia and how that may be contributing to a democratic backsliding in Turkey? Thank you.
Thank you. I know that you addressed the question to me, and I would like to answer. However, I feel like Mr. Schenken could provide a fuller answer to all of those questions.
And I'm fine with that. Feel free to defer to him on whatever you think is appropriate.
Sure, I'm happy to. Let me start with the background questions, and I'll move into the recommendations. Next election cycle in Turkey is in 2023, simultaneous presidential and parliamentary elections. There's an option for early elections. It's unlikely to be held, in my opinion, because the system doesn't favor that.
You mean the early elections are unlikely?
Yes, are unlikely, but I do believe elections will be held in 2023. That gives President Erdogan at this time 4 more years to work on further consolidating the position that he's in. He's in a very rough spot right now because of the war in Syria and because of the economy, but he has a lot of time to work it out. So in that sense, I think he will probably be there for at least another term after that, would be my professional guess.
Thank you.
The relationship between Turkey and Russia, as I stated earlier in response to the Congresswoman's question, it has been growing tighter. There's not a lot of visibility at there's kind of a black box at the personal level in terms of what really happens between these two leaders and what may happen in terms of exchanges that happen between them and between their bank accounts. And that's an important question. That's an important aspect of all of this. We have to understand, and this is the biggest issue behind autocratization. When a system becomes autocratized, you get tied down into one individual's or one family's or one clique's direct financial, often, interests. And it's very hard to undo that. What Congress can or should do? There are already quite strong sanctions options that are available, that are in law, especially through CATSA, the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act. The S-400 purchase and delivery qualifies for those sanctions. There's no question about it. I believe Congress could perhaps pass clarifying legislation if the administration needs more of a nudge in that direction. There could be additional nudges on the Halk Bank front, because again, there are clear violations of sanctions that were placed on Iran in the Halk Bank case. Those are the sanctions perspectives, and I think those are adequate. I don't actually think we need a new legislation package on this. But what we do need a new package on is support for democratic actors in Turkey. The U.S. has never really done this in Turkey. Turkey has always been a bit of a gap in terms of democracy promotion activities, and I think it would be appropriate for Congress to take the lead in pushing the government, including other democracy promoters, to take action and to support people in Turkey in a significant way. The thing to remember about that is that Turkey is a very big country. It's a wealthy country. It is not a small lift. To really have impact, you're going to have to invest and put real money towards it. Thank you.
Thank you.
If I could just add a little on Nate's last point, because I lived in Turkey in 2003, and at that point in time, the promise of European Union accession was bright and vibrant. I think we would all agree that right now there's little to no chance that Turkey is acceding to the European Union. So absent that as a direction, another point I'd make is that, with the crackdown after the coup attempt, the people attempting the coup were those who had a pro-European orientation. So Erdogan is very much looking eastward and seeing where he can get the best deal. I wanted to add on to Nate's point about our legacy in Turkey. There has been kind of bad policy in Turkey for many years across administrations where we had this implicit agreement to not comment on the internal democratic deterioration and problems with rule of law. There had not been assistance from the United States in terms of democracy and governance. There was never a USAID office there. So in order to fundamentally, for the longer term, change the relationship with Turkey, there needs to be a much bigger relationship, and it needs to be multi-vectored. It needs to be, as Nate was talking about, looking at ways to penalize them with sanctions, but there also needs to be an investment in the people, go out beyond Istanbul, develop ties in the regions, invest in civil society, independent media, kind of the full range of democracy and governance support that we have provided to other countries that are in such serious democratic decline.
Thank you very much. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Our committee vice chair, Ms. Spanberger of Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You all have spoken very clearly about the dangers of democratic backsliding in Europe, and I appreciate your insights and recommendations. I am concerned about the attacks on the free press, the undermining of an independent judiciary, and consolidation of power in the hands of a few, particularly for their own financial benefit. But especially for me as a former intelligence officer, I want to focus some of our time on the intelligence risks associated with our NATO partners' closer ties with Russia. Not only are these relationships concerning from a geopolitical standpoint, but certainly activities may be giving Russia a base of operations and access to NATO and European information. Without transparency and rule of law, these activities may go unchecked. And in March, Hungary paved the way for the Russian International Investment Bank to move its headquarters from Moscow to Budapest. The Hungarian government is providing the Soviet-era bank, which was reportedly used as a cover for the KGB, diplomatic immunity for its employees, its building, and all of its financial activities. And as I understand it, this diplomatic immunity extends to any of the bank's employees or foreign guests who could then move freely throughout Europe. Ms. Cork and Ms. Hooper, you both mentioned the IIB in your opening statements. And could you tell us more about this Russian state-owned bank, the liberties Hungary has granted it, and what impact this could have on our national security, European national security, and NATO security?
Yes, I'm glad that you are concerned about this. The IIB has, I think, raised alarm bells in both the EU and here in the US. As you mentioned, granting diplomatic security to both for the building itself, anything that happens, diplomatic immunity, anything that happens in the building and then all of the employees is problematic, but then also being able to grant Schengen access to any of the guests of the bank can mean that individuals that, for example, are sanctioned by the US or facing other sanctions can be enabled to enter the EU. There are also concerns that the bank could be used for intelligence gathering, as we've seen other entities. For example, in France, you saw entities near the General Prosecutor's Office that were owned by Russia used as intelligence gathering mechanisms. And you could also see the bank being used for money laundering, which is, I know, not an intelligence concern, but it does raise concerns about significant corruption.
I would just add to that, having Having worked in Russia and seen, they worked market testing their tactics in Russia and in the neighborhood, and they have always it's sort of a black mirror of what they thought we were doing in Russia. So a lot of things that they will claim are just legitimate activities, when they open an NGO here in the United States or provide funding. For example, American University has a big Russian center that is believed to be kind of a front for propaganda. So I think with Russia, the investment bank is a very troubling example, and I think does give them, Putin, essentially a Trojan horse into Hungary. I would note that in the Czech Republic, too, there's been a notable uptick in both Chinese and Russian intelligence presence there. But I would say that Russia defines espionage more broadly. They see civil society as opportunities for espionage. They don't view it as legitimate. So and I would also note Hungary has been increasing the copycat this tactic, trying to infiltrate think tanks here in Washington, D.C., academic institutions. So I think that we need to kind of have a broader lens view into what might be intelligence activities for Russia and China and Hungary.
Thank you. And Ms. Hooper, I appreciate you bringing up the concept of money laundering, which in fact does have significant ramifications within the intelligence community, because those who seek to launder money are generally involved in authoritarian governments, terrorist activity, narco trafficking, and the like. And so it is a vitally important element of our intelligence community ability to track nefarious activity by following the money. Do you perceive that our European allies recognize the significant threat of this bank's ability to access Schengen countries through the freedoms that they've granted to this bank and its guests?
I don't think that, I think that there has been some concern, but I think that the alarm is just now increasing, and of course the bank already exists, and so this is problematic that there hasn't been an established method for dealing with this or concerns expressed to Hungary.
I have also heard some concerns that the U.S. government has had sort of a hands-off approach on this, so that there has been an implicit green light in terms of our relationship with Hungary that this is okay.
Thank you. I am over time, though I could go on with my questions, but I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Cicilline, Rhode Island.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for calling this hearing. Thank you to our witnesses for this really important and insightful testimony. I'd like to focus my questions on the role of the free press, and particularly I want to begin with you, Ms. Hooper, if I may. Can you describe the differences in the media landscape across NATO allies in Central Europe, Eastern Europe, and Turkey, kind of just broadly? And then I want to go specifically to some questions about Hungary and Poland.
I would say that we're seeing some restrictions in a number of countries. However, the greatest restrictions are in those countries that we have mostly discussed today, being Poland, Hungary, and Turkey, probably in reverse order.
Thank you. And in particular, I wonder if you could just speak for a moment about the impact of the kind of restriction on a free press and its impact on kind of institutional stability and democracy broadly. Why should people care about this?
I think that a free press enables citizens to learn about whether their representatives are representing them, whether their interests are being properly represented in government, and then to express themselves with respect to whether those representatives are responsive to them as well. So I think it's significant, it's a pillar of democracy and so important, and that's why it's frustrating and concerning that it's under attack.
And with respect to Hungary, am I correct in that nearly 80% of the media in Hungary is owned by the government or government allies?
That's one estimate. Some estimates are higher, and I would say that outside of Budapest, the number is pretty close to, if not 100%, which is very concerning.
And so how would you describe kind of the state of a free press in Hungary? Does it even exist?
I think that it exists in only limited places, limited geographic places within Hungary, and for most citizens of Hungary, there is essentially no free press.
And I just want to ask one other sort of related question. I was very disturbed last year when the Hungarian government forced the Central European University, a U.S. institution of very high regard, to cease operations in Hungary. Why is it important to protect civil society organizations and not improperly discriminate against foreign-funded civil society organizations? And what can you tell us about that case?
I think that it's important to preserve civil society because they are representing those parts of the population that are trying to make the government better, that are trying to make society better, and they are interacting with citizens who, for example, might not be able to connect to the government with their concerns. And so in order to prevent those citizens from becoming angry and either protesting or turning to radicalization or other illegal means, they go to civil society. So civil society serves an important role.
Thank you. Ms. Cork, I also am interested to know how the political changes in Hungary, and particularly Fidesz's consolidation of power, has affected minorities in the country, such as the Roma and the Jewish population, and to what extent is the government actively using anti-Semitic messaging in their effort to sort of consolidate power?
That has been a central tactic used by Orban throughout his rise, using fear-mongering of the other. The use of the migrant issue was to stoke fear about the other. I have been in many debates with Hungarian officials on this, and they say, oh, there's not a anti-Semitism problem here, but he himself uses George Soros as the boogeyman. The imagery he used in the posters were direct from the Nazi era, and he used that as his kind of single campaign advertisement. But they've also engaged in historical revisionism. But the message that they unabashedly put forward is that Hungary is for white Christians. And they can say there isn't anti-Semitism in Hungary, but the message that they are giving is that others are not welcome.
And finally, I want to just turn to Poland. The country's ranking in the annual World Press Freedom Index published by Reporters Without Borders has fallen every year since Law and Justice has been in power, from 18th in 2015 to 59th in the most recent survey. And whoever is best equipped to answer this, but what is the current state of media freedom in Poland? How has it evolved, and what are some specific indicators as to where it's headed, and what might we do to turn that around?
So unfortunately, we are seeing greater attacks on journalism and media freedom in Poland when reporters, such as those from some of the main independent outlets, Gazeta Wyborcza, when they're reporting on acts of corruption or religious infringement in the government, they are being sued for defamation cases. Media outlets are suffering tax cases. They're being targeted by the anti-monopoly service. So they are fighting these legal cases instead of doing their work. So we need to be supporting media freedom. The U.S. needs to support media freedom in Poland and support independent journalism there as well. I think that means, for me, we need to be supporting civil society in Poland, and the U.S. should be providing financial support to those in the region.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I think the testimony by President Walesa, where he concluded, given his background and what he went through in his life, when he concluded that the situation today is more daunting, in his opinion, than it was 30 years ago, should cause some pause on all our parts. I think it was reinforced by many of the specifics, and I want to thank the witnesses for doing this, the specifics that you outlined, and the things where there's opportunity to act going forward. But I must say that, if I could, that there's a common theme of a lack of leadership by the U.S. currently, of absence of policy by the U.S., and an uncertainty surrounding resolve. These are things that have to be addressed. And the common message that the U.S. Has to be a leader in this to be successful. We can't rely on others. And we have a self-interest in terms of our own security, our own values, our own economic future, all invested in these issues. So it's not a case of concern for everyone else in the world. There should be an enlightened self-interest in the way this country acts right now. So I want to thank you for your testimony. I want to tell you that this committee and the full committee on Foreign Affairs will do our best to be a voice in trying to bridge all these gaps that were outlined and realize that, as your testimony reflected, and I think the President Walesa's testimony reflected, each and every one of us has an individual responsibility as citizens to engage in this as well. So thank you for with everything else that's going on. This is really an important priority for our country right now. The members of the committee may have additional questions for you in writing, and we're asking you to please respond to those. So this can be done, the record of this hearing will be open for 10 business days, and to receive those responses should they be necessary. I want to thank you again for being here, and I shall adjourn the hearing.